It wasn't the first time Ryan had heard strange stories about the house. It was old, 500 years old to be exact. The kind of house that stood through generations, filled with secrets and memories most people had long forgotten. Ryan had heard the rumors, whispers about the tragedies that had happened inside its walls. Fires, accidents, people who had disappeared without a trace. It was the kind of house that other kids would be afraid of. But not Ryan. Ryan, at just 11 years old, wasn't the type to get scared easily. Not by a few creaky floors or dark basements. To him, the house was just that, a house. His parents liked to talk about its rich history, but Ryan didn't care much about that. He had his football, his games, and his imagination. That afternoon, like so many others, he was playing in the hallway with his favorite football. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the house, but Ryan didn't notice. He was too focused on his game. The house had seen centuries of life pass through it. Built long ago, it had been home to countless families, many of whom never left. Some had died in the great fire that nearly consumed the place over 100 years ago. Others simply disappeared, their fates a mystery even now. Local townspeople avoided the house, calling it cursed. But to Ryan's family, it was just a house. They moved in a few months ago, not paying much mind to the rumors. His parents didn't believe in ghost stories, and neither did Ryan. Ryan's football bounced rhythmically against the walls, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. He loved the way it rebounded, sometimes bouncing back into his hands, other times skittering across the floor, forcing him to chase after it. Today was no different. His parents were upstairs, busy with their own things, leaving him to play on his own. Ryan tossed the football again, watching it hit the wall and roll toward the stairs. It took a bad bounce, slipping from his grasp and tumbling down toward the basement door. The sound of it bouncing grew fainter as it descended the stairs. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, and the football rolled gently to a stop just in front of it. Ryan hesitated, staring down the dark stairwell. The basement always gave him a strange feeling, but there was nothing down there. His football was just sitting at the bottom of the steps, Ryan saying to himself, "It's just a football." He shrugged. It was his favorite after all. And besides, he wasn't afraid of the basement. With a confident step, Ryan moved toward the stairs. The basement was darker than usual. The single light bulb that hung from the ceiling was flickering, casting weak, uneven light. The cool air rose up from below, carrying with it a faint smell of damp earth and something metallic, something old. Ryan carefully made his way down the stairs, his hand trailing along the old wooden banister. Each step creaked beneath his feet, but Ryan didn't mind. He had done this 100 times before. When he reached the bottom, the football was there, just where he expected it to be, sitting perfectly still in the middle of the floor. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at it. The basement was quiet, the kind of silence that made the air feel thick and heavy. But it was just a room, and he wasn't scared. Not yet. Ryan reached out to pick up the football. As his fingers brushed the football, something happened. Before Ryan could grab it, the football began to roll. Slowly at first, just a small, deliberate movement, rolling away from him, deeper into the shadows of the basement. Ryan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He watched as the football, on its own, moved further and further into the darkness. His heart pounded, each beat loud in the silence. The football came to a stop in the far corner, where the flickering light barely reached. Ryan stared, unsure of what he had just seen. His mind raced. Maybe it was just the floor. Maybe it wasn't flat. But it didn't feel like that. The way the football moved, it felt deliberate, like something was pulling it. For the first time, Ryan felt a twinge of fear. Ryan bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed through the hallway, calling out for his parents. Ryan panicked, said, "Mom, Dad, something's wrong with the basement." The football, it moved. His parents looked at him, confused but calm. His mom said, "Ryan, sweetheart, it's probably just the old floorboards. This house is ancient, remember?" His dad then said, "Yeah, the house has quirks. It's nothing to worry about, bud." They didn't believe him. His parents brushed it off like it was nothing, like it was just another strange thing about the old house. But Ryan knew what he saw. He wasn't imagining it. Ryan, frustrated, said, "But I'm telling you, it moved." His mom, smiling, replied, "It's just an old house, Ryan." Ryan's words fell on deaf ears. That night, the house felt different. It was quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath. Ryan lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about the football, how it had moved on its own. Then he heard it. Thump, thump. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of something bouncing. Ryan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise was coming from downstairs, from the basement. He crept out of bed, his feet cold against the wooden floor, and tiptoed to his parents' room. He knocked softly. No answer. "Mom? Dad?" Still nothing. Slowly, he opened the door. The room was empty. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His parents were gone. The bed was neatly made, the room exactly as it had been before. But they were nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through Ryan as he rushed through the house, calling for them. But no one answered. The house felt colder now, the air heavy with a silence that was almost suffocating. And then he heard it again, the sound of the football. Ryan's eyes darted toward the basement door. It was open again. Slowly, impossibly, it had opened. Wide. He couldn't stop himself. His feet moved on their own, taking him toward the door. The air around him seemed to grow colder with every step. He peered down the dark stairs. The football was there, sitting perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs, as if it had been waiting for him. But this time, there was something else. In the far corner of the basement, a shadow moved. Not a person, not an animal, just a shadow. It seemed to ripple, to pulse, like it was alive. Watching. Ryan froze. His breath hitched in his throat. The shadow. It began to move toward him, slow, deliberate. Closer and closer. And then, the door behind him slammed shut. Ryan was alone now. Completely alone. The house, this ancient house that had seen so much tragedy, had claimed him too. And the last thing he saw was the football rolling toward him. It was a cold, rainy night. Emily, just 12 years old, was home alone for the first time. Her parents had gone out for dinner and promised to be back by 10. She tried to keep herself busy, sitting on the couch with her favorite book, the soft hum of the television in the background, providing a false sense of security. But tonight, something about the house felt different. The rain pattered against the windows. Usually, Emily found that soothing, but tonight, it felt unsettling. Every drop felt heavier. The silence between each one seemed to stretch on forever. Her eyes scanned the room. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls. The clock ticked loudly on the mantel, each second amplifying her nervousness. And then, she heard it. A noise. From downstairs. Faint, but unmistakable. She froze, her eyes darting toward the hallway. What was that? Emily sat still, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just the house settling, she thought. But the sound, it was different. It didn't sound like creaking wood or the groan of old pipes. It was deliberate, like something or someone moving. Another sound. This time, it was clearer. Footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from downstairs. Emily's heart raced. Her mind scrambled for a logical explanation. She was sure she had locked the door after her parents left. The windows were closed. The alarm was set. But these footsteps were real. She strained her ears, listening as the sound continued. Thump, thump. Each step echoed louder than the last. They were slow, deliberate, like something or someone was taking its time. Her eyes flicked to the front door. It was too far away. She couldn't make a run for it without getting past the stairs. Her phone, left on the kitchen counter, completely out of reach. Her fingers gripped the edge of the couch as her mind spun in fear. Do I check it out, or do I stay here? The footsteps stopped. Everything was silent. Too silent. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she imagined it. She slowly exhaled, relaxing ever so slightly into the cushions. But just as she thought she might be safe, the footsteps started again, this time faster. Closer. They weren't downstairs anymore. They were on the staircase. Her body tensed. She could hear the floorboards creak with each step, every sound dragging her deeper into her fear. The slow, rhythmic thud of each footstep sent chills down her spine. Someone, or something, was coming up. Climbing the stairs, Emily didn't dare move. She could feel the air in the room grow colder. Her mind was racing. Do I hide? Do I run? The sound grew closer. She could hear the soft groan of the wood beneath each step. Then, it stopped. Right outside her door. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She sat perfectly still, every muscle in her body frozen with fear. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. And then, the door creaked. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The door. It was opening, ever so slowly. She squeezed her eyes shut, too terrified to look, too terrified to move. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft, chilling, and unmistakable. It called her name. Emily! Her eyes shot open, but the room was empty. The door stood ajar, but no one was there. She felt her skin crawl. The whisper, it was so close, right behind her. Her body trembled as she forced herself to turn and look. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. The house was still. For a brief moment, Emily thought maybe it was over. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But just as she let her guard down, there was a new sound. It wasn't a thump. It wasn't footsteps. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the window behind her. Her heart raced as she turned slowly. The window was cracked open, but she was certain she'd locked it earlier. Now it was slightly ajar, letting in the cold night air. And that's when she saw it. In the darkness, pressed against the glass, was a hand, pale, cold, and pressing harder with every second. Then she heard the whisper again. Emily. This time, it was coming from the window, from outside. The car's engine hummed as it bounced over the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust behind them. Kevin had never been so far into the woods before. He stared out the window at the endless trees that seemed to close in around the car. His parents had mentioned his grandparents' cabin before, an old secluded log house deep in the forest. Today, Kevin was finally going to meet them. He wasn't sure what to expect. He'd never met his grandparents before. His mom always talked about how wonderful they were, but he had never seen a photo of them. This was going to be his first time. After what felt like forever, the car came to a stop. Kevin looked up and saw the cabin for the first time. The house was ancient, with moss growing on its roof and the logs darkened by years of rain and snow. It sat alone in the woods, far away from anything familiar. The air was thick with the smell of pine trees, and an uneasy silence surrounded the cabin. "Here we are," his mom said cheerfully. She glanced back at Kevin, smiling. "Your grandparents are excited to meet you, Kevin. I'm sure you're going to have a great time here." Kevin nodded, but deep down, something felt off. He couldn't explain why, but he had a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. He was about to step into a completely unfamiliar world, and it made him nervous. His mom leaned over to give him a hug. "We'll see you in a few days, honey. Enjoy your time with Grandma and Grandpa." Kevin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the cabin again. His parents were already walking back to the car to leave, not noticing how Kevin hesitated. He hadn't seen anyone yet, just the empty, dark porch of the cabin. It looked cold and unwelcoming. As his parents drove off, Kevin turned and started walking toward the house. He dragged his backpack behind him, the weight of it oddly comforting, like a piece of home he was leaving behind. He reached the front door and knocked softly. There was no answer at first, so he knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open slowly, and standing in the doorway was an elderly couple. The man was thin, his face pale and weathered, his eyes sharp and unsettlingly focused on Kevin. The woman was shorter, with thin white hair that hung limp around her face. She gave him a wide, almost manic smile, her teeth too white in the dim light of the porch. "Hello, Kevin," the old woman said, her voice slow but friendly. "Come inside, dear. We've been waiting for you." Kevin hesitated for a moment. The couple didn't look like the grandparents his mom had described. They seemed different, but he had no choice but to go inside. As he stepped over the threshold, a cold draft hit him. The air inside was stale, and the smell of wood and dust filled his nose. It was like stepping back in time, into a world he didn't recognize. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit, and the furniture looked old, with a strange kind of heavy comfort to it. "Make yourself at home, Kevin," the old man said, his voice thick with age. His eyes never left Kevin, even as he shuffled slowly across the room. "Take a seat. We'll get you something to eat soon." Kevin nodded and took a seat at the small wooden table. The old couple didn't sit with him, instead moving around the room silently, as if they had no need to speak. Something about the way they moved felt unnatural, like they were too still for their age. Kevin's skin crawled, but he tried to push it aside. Maybe it was just how old people were. He'd never spent much time with anyone that old before. The first day was quiet. Kevin spent most of the time in his room, exploring the small cabin. He tried to ignore the strange feeling that lingered in the air, the way the old couple seemed to watch him from the corners of his eyes. That evening, when Kevin went down to the kitchen to get a glass of water, he noticed something odd. Grandma, Charlotte, she had called herself, was standing at the stove, her back to him. The smell in the air was wrong, thick and metallic. It wasn't the warm smell of food he expected. It was something unsettling. Kevin peeked over her shoulder. She was cooking something in the oven, and it didn't look like any meat Kevin had ever seen. There was a large, furry object, some kind of animal, its black eyes staring back at him from the oven rack. Kevin recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. It looked like a raccoon, its fur still intact. The next day, Kevin tried to act normal. He went outside to explore the woods, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. But things only got stranger as the day went on. That afternoon, he looked out the window of his room and saw Grandpa outside. He was running in circles. No, more like pacing in a tight, frantic loop around the cabin. His arms hung stiff at his sides, his movements jerky, like he was stuck in a repetitive motion. Kevin stared at him from the window, confused and terrified. Why was Grandpa doing that? It didn't make any sense. He blinked, and when he looked back, Grandpa had stopped. He stood still in the yard, staring up at the cabin, his face expressionless. Kevin quickly ducked out of view, his heart pounding in his chest. The next day, as Kevin sat in the living room, he felt a growing sense of dread. The cabin was too quiet, and the couple's odd behavior was becoming harder to ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the strange meals. It wasn't just Grandpa's odd running. It was everything. Later that afternoon, Kevin heard the car engine in the distance. It was faint at first, but growing louder. His heart leapt in his chest. It was his parents, coming to pick him up. Kevin ran outside the moment he saw their car pulling up. He rushed to his mom's side, eager to leave the strange cabin behind. "Well, did you enjoy your time here?" his mom asked with a smile, pulling Kevin into a hug. Kevin hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. "It was okay." She glanced at him with a puzzled look. "Did you have fun with Patty and Ed?" Kevin's blood went cold. Patty and Ed. He stared at his mom, his throat tight. "But I was with Charlotte and Frank." His mom frowned, looking confused. "No, sweetheart. Patty and Ed, your grandparents. You spent time with them, didn't you?" Kevin's mind reeled, his stomach dropping to his feet. The couple he had been staying with weren't his grandparents. They weren't his grandparents at all.